Speed has always been more than numbers on a gauge. It is a pursuit of something higher, something that challenges physics and pride at the same time. In racing, victory does not come to the loudest or the prettiest, but to the machine that understands the air, the pavement, and the limits of courage. The late 1960s were a perfect storm of ambition and rivalry, when manufacturers treated every checkered flag as proof of national identity and engineering dominance. It was a time when rules could still be bent, and innovation often looked absurd before it looked brilliant. Out of that fever came a car that looked like it belonged on a runway more than a racetrack, with wings and shapes that mocked convention yet redefined the future of competition. This is the story of how obsession with speed turned into one of the most fascinating chapters in motorsport history. If you love stories where design genius meets racing glory, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell us what car you want to see next. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona began as a problem to solve, not a concept to celebrate. Dodge was struggling to keep up with faster, more aerodynamic rivals on NASCAR's long superspeedways, where high drag and instability at 190 miles per hour could decide a championship. The existing Charger had raw power but the shape of a brick. At high speeds, it lifted rather than hugged the track. Engineers at Chrysler's Performance Division, led by a small group of aerodynamic specialists, decided to approach the problem scientifically rather than stylistically. They wanted to neutralize drag and generate downforce without sacrificing stability. And that mission produced one of the strangest silhouettes in automotive history. The Charger Daytona was unlike any muscle car seen before. Its extended nose cone, almost 2 feet long, sliced through the air, while the rear carried an aluminum wing mounted on tall vertical stabilizers that seemed excessive but served a precise purpose. The height was chosen so the trunk could still open under it, yet it also lifted the wing into clean airflow, improving traction at extreme speeds. Every curve and rivet on the Daytona had a reason. It was born in a wind tunnel, tested at facilities previously used for aerospace research, and refined through data instead of guesswork. For 1969, that was revolutionary. Before the Charger Daytona, NASCAR teams treated aerodynamics as an afterthought. They focused on displacement and gearing, not air pressure or turbulence. The Daytona changed that overnight. The car's engine options were familiar, either the 440 Magnum V8 or the optional 426 Hemi. But the way those engines interacted with the streamlined body created a new benchmark. Suddenly, horsepower felt more efficient, more controlled. Where the previous Charger struggled above 185 miles per hour, the Daytona could run well over 200, shattering psychological and physical limits alike. Early tests stunned the engineers themselves. This was no styling exercise, it was functional art. When the Charger Daytona debuted, the reaction was mixed. Fans laughed, rivals rolled their eyes, and even some Dodge dealers worried it was too strange to sell. The long nose and massive wing made it look like a prototype from another planet. But beneath that awkwardness was a kind of precision that only racing could justify. The car's balance on the track was remarkable. It could take corners faster, stay planted on the straights, and cut through air with surgical smoothness. What most people didn't know was that Chrysler engineers had used scale models in a full wind tunnel program, one of the first for an American race car. They discovered that simply smoothing edges or lowering the stance would not be enough. They needed to reimagine how air moved around the car. That realization set the Charger Daytona apart from every other competitor of its time. Its dominance was not immediate but inevitable. Once the car hit the track, results came fast. Drivers reported that the Daytona felt almost unshakable at speeds that made others nervous. On superspeedways like Talladega, where long straights punished inefficient designs, the Daytona had no equal. It was the first stock car to officially break the 200-mile-per-hour barrier, with Buddy Baker behind the wheel. That number became folklore, proving that aerodynamics could achieve what raw power alone could not. Yet success brought scrutiny. NASCAR officials began to question whether such specialized engineering violated the spirit of stock car racing. Other teams cried unfair advantage, claiming the Daytona was too far removed from production vehicles. But technically, it was legal. Dodge had built enough road-going versions to satisfy homologation rules, though those cars often sat unsold on dealer lots because few buyers wanted a giant wing in their rearview mirror. The Charger Daytona's impact reached beyond competition. It forced the entire industry to reconsider how shape and performance intertwined. Designers began sketching cars with smoother lines, recessed grilles, and more integrated spoilers. Aerodynamics became part of the conversation in Detroit boardrooms, not just racetrack garages. The Daytona had proven that airflow could be engineered just like horsepower. That shift marked the beginning of a new era in American performance cars. Still, within the Chrysler camp, the victory came with pressure. Success meant everyone wanted to know what would come next. Engineers had created something that won races but polarized audiences. The challenge now was whether they could refine the concept further, or if NASCAR's new rules would shut the door on their progress. The stage was set for a confrontation between innovation and regulation, one that would define not only the Charger Daytona's legacy but also the future of American motorsport. The next phase would test how far Dodge could push its advantage before the system pushed back. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona entered its second act with momentum and suspicion in equal measure. NASCAR officials, facing complaints from competitors, began examining whether the car's aerodynamic advantage was too extreme for the spirit of stock car racing. On paper, it was legal. In practice, it was rewriting the rules of speed. The Daytona's nose and wing were the result of rigorous testing, not styling gimmicks, but to rivals it looked like an unfair leap ahead. Still, Dodge and its engineering team were not ready to back down. They had built a machine that embodied science in motion, and its results on the track made the case better than any press release. As the 1970 season approached, Chrysler doubled down. The Charger Daytona inspired a sibling model, the Plymouth Superbird, that carried the same aerodynamic formula to another brand within the family. Together, these cars became known as the Winged Warriors, and their presence on NASCAR grids turned races into high-speed demonstrations of aerodynamic dominance. The Charger Daytona's mechanical foundation remained similar: heavy-duty suspension, bulletproof drivetrain, and the iconic 426 Hemi, but its advantage was always the air. Competitors could not keep up on superspeedways like Daytona and Talladega, where the car's streamlined body and towering wing created stability that others could only dream of. The irony was that these radical shapes were initially met with ridicule by fans who thought they were too outrageous, even for racing. Yet once the Daytona started lapping the field, skepticism gave way to disbelief. The wing, nearly 2 feet tall, was mocked as decorative until physics proved otherwise. It planted the car to the ground at speeds where traditional designs became unstable. Drivers could stay wide open through corners that previously required lifting. The Daytona turned aerodynamic theory into tangible victory laps. Every record broken by the Charger Daytona increased tension in the NASCAR community. The organization's leadership realized that if manufacturers kept chasing aerodynamic perfection, the speeds could exceed safe limits for both drivers and spectators. Safety barriers and tire technology of the era were not ready for consistent 200-mile-per-hour racing. Thus, the very success that made the Daytona legendary also made it controversial. NASCAR responded by drafting new homologation rules that effectively banned such extreme body modifications. Teams would now have to run cars closer to showroom models, with restrictions that neutralized the aerodynamic advantage of the Winged Warriors. That decision marked the beginning of the end for the Daytona's dominance, but it also secured its mythic status. The Charger Daytona's short reign left an indelible impression. It demonstrated that American engineering could innovate as boldly as any European racing program, blending muscle and mathematics into a single package. Engineers had learned lessons that would influence every future race car, and even mainstream production vehicles. The use of wind tunnels, the understanding of downforce, and the refinement of airflow efficiency became standard practice. Chrysler's team had effectively dragged the sport into a new scientific era. Meanwhile, the limited production road versions of the Charger Daytona began to develop a cult following. What once sat unsold became highly sought after. Collectors who once ignored the car now saw it as a symbol of fearless experimentation. Its aluminum wing and nose cone, originally designed to slice through NASCAR's superspeedways, became icons of 1960s engineering audacity. Decades later, those same features would influence concept cars and performance studies across the industry. The Charger Daytona proved that sometimes, the weirdest ideas are the ones that endure. Beyond the engineering, the Daytona also changed perception. Before its debut, muscle cars were seen primarily as brute force machines. The Daytona introduced the idea that American performance could also be sophisticated. It was not just about bigger engines, but about smarter design. Its success validated a new kind of competition where data, not just displacement, determined victory. That cultural shift rippled through both racing and consumer markets. Suddenly, aerodynamics became a buzzword in marketing brochures, and spoilers started appearing on street cars that would never see a racetrack. The Charger Daytona made science cool, and for an industry built on image, that was a revolution. As the rulebook tightened and the 1971 season approached, the winged warriors faded from competition. But the lessons they taught did not disappear. NASCAR entered an era of measured regulation, balancing innovation with safety. Engineers learned to work within limits, but they never forgot what the Charger Daytona had proven: that design and engineering, when aligned, could redefine what was possible. The Daytona's brief life on the track left behind something far more lasting than trophies. It left a template for how racing could evolve through creativity and precision rather than brute force. The next chapter in its story would not be about competition, but about legacy. How a car built to dominate for a single season became an everlasting benchmark for ingenuity and courage. The legacy of the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona did not fade when it left the racetrack. It only changed form. What began as an experiment in aerodynamic engineering became a legend, a reference point for how innovation can transcend its own era. By the mid-1970s, the Charger Daytona was already a collectible curiosity. Car enthusiasts who once laughed at its appearance now recognized it as a turning point. Its wing, its pointed nose, its unapologetic purpose, all stood for an age when engineers could still build without restraint. In the years that followed, the Charger Daytona influenced not just race cars but design philosophy itself. Automotive engineers across the United States began to view airflow as an integral part of performance. The lessons learned from the Daytona's wind tunnel sessions appeared in later muscle cars, stock cars, and even passenger vehicles. The principle was simple. Less drag meant more speed and better fuel efficiency. The Charger Daytona had proven that the air itself was a resource to be managed, not resisted. For Chrysler, the Daytona's triumph marked both a high point and a closing chapter. After NASCAR's rule changes, the company could no longer field cars with such radical features, but the knowledge gained filtered through to production and engineering programs for decades. The Daytona had effectively turned Chrysler into an aerodynamic pioneer in Detroit's muscle car wars. Even though regulations had neutralized its competitive edge, the ideas born from it continued to shape the future. Collectors began to realize how special those limited production Daytonas were. Only around 500 were built to satisfy NASCAR's homologation requirements, and fewer survived the years in pristine condition. Each surviving example became a museum piece, not because of luxury or rarity alone, but because of what it represented: the moment when ambition outran convention. Auction prices climbed, and by the 21st century, the Charger Daytona had reached iconic status. It was no longer seen as an oddball experiment, but as one of the most important American cars ever made. Beyond the collector market, the Charger Daytona's image found a second life in popular culture. Its extreme profile appeared in documentaries, racing retrospectives, and video games, symbolizing the fearless energy of late 1960s motorsport. When modern engineers revisited aerodynamic design for high-performance vehicles, they often cited the Daytona as a spiritual ancestor. Even Dodge's later performance models drew aesthetic inspiration from its heritage, reminding audiences that the company had once built a machine so far ahead of its time that the sport itself had to catch up. The Charger Daytona also became an educational touchstone. Students in engineering programs studied its aerodynamic properties as examples of early applied physics in automotive design. The simplicity of its principles, longer nose, higher wing, smoother surfaces, made it accessible, while the measurable results made it inspiring. It taught that innovation does not always come from complex technology. Sometimes, it comes from seeing old problems with new eyes. The car's cultural significance grew precisely because it stood at the intersection of power and intellect. In an era when speed was often equated with excess, the Daytona showed that precision could be just as thrilling. That is why, decades later, enthusiasts still talk about it with reverence. It was more than a car. It was a moment in history when the boundaries of design and daring perfectly aligned. When viewed today, the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona tells a story about the courage to experiment, It reminds us that progress in motorsport often comes from those willing to look strange before they look smart. The Daytona's aerodynamic shape still captures attention because it represents that blend of artistry and science. Every detail, the tall rear wing, the wind-sculpted front, the tucked rear window, was built for a single purpose: to master speed through understanding, not brute force. And that principle remains timeless. Whether in racing, design, or innovation itself, the Charger Daytona's legacy continues to resonate. Its short-lived dominance reshaped how teams and manufacturers approached performance, safety, and regulation. It proved that limits could inspire new ideas rather than stifle them. Today, when people see a Daytona in person, they see the embodiment of a question that still defines motorsport. How far can we go when we dare to rethink everything? That question is why the car remains legendary, and why its influence endures well beyond its single season of glory. The Charger Daytona was not just built to win races. It was built to change the conversation about what winning really means. And in that sense, it succeeded more completely than anyone in 1969 could have imagined. The end of its racing career was not the end of its story. It was the beginning of a legacy that continues to shape the very idea of performance and progress. The story of the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona closes where it began, with a pursuit of speed and the courage to build something no one else dared. Looking back, the Daytona was not simply a product of competition, but of conviction. It was an answer to a challenge that seemed impossible, delivered by engineers who believed that air could be harnessed as an ally instead of an enemy. The Charger Daytona was their proof, a rolling laboratory that turned skepticism into astonishment. In one season, it forced NASCAR, and the entire automotive world, to rethink what was possible. The Charger Daytona showed that power without control was waste, and that design could be as potent as displacement. It redefined what a race car could be, and left behind a legacy that still commands respect decades later. Each surviving example is a piece of rolling history, representing the brief moment when technology ran ahead of regulation and created something unrepeatable. The Charger Daytona's wing and nose may have been born out of necessity, but they became symbols of daring imagination. Even in today's world of computer modeling and carbon fiber, the spirit of the Daytona remains relevant. It reminds every designer and racer that breakthroughs come from the willingness to look beyond convention, to build not for comfort or applause but for achievement. For Dodge, it stands as one of the purest expressions of its performance identity. A car that won by rewriting the rules of physics. For motorsport as a whole, it marks a turning point, a bridge between brute strength and aerodynamic intelligence. The Charger Daytona's reign may have been brief, but its impact was permanent. It remains a monument to an era when innovation moved faster than hesitation, and ambition turned sheet metal into legend. That is the enduring power of the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, a car that did not just chase victory. It redefined the meaning of speed itself.